Hello everyone! Tonight we begin with a tale of why it was deadly to be a chimney sweep in Victorian London. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, do give the video a like and subscribe. It truly helps the channel grow. And write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see who joins us from different corners of the world. Now, dim the lights, perhaps switch on a fan for a soft background hum, and let's journey together into this dark chapter of history. The smell never leaves you, you know. Even now, as I sit by this modest fire in my cottage near Hampstead Heath, the scent of coal smoke carries me back across the decades to those narrow flues and darker times. My hands, though clean now, still bear the permanent stains beneath the nails' black crescents that no amount of soap could ever wash away. They are the marks of my trade, my childhood, my very survival in the sooty belly of London. I was 7 years old when I first descended into darkness. The year was 1842, and Her Majesty had been upon the throne for 5 years, though such grand matters meant little to a boy whose world consisted of the cramped tenement room I shared with my mother and 3 younger siblings in Dorset Street, Spitalfields. The cholera had taken my father the previous winter, leaving behind a woman whose cough grew worse each month and children whose ribs showed through their thin shirts like the bars of a cage. Mother had tried her best with piecework sewing shirts for 3p a dozen when her fingers could still manage the needle steady enough. But the consumption that had settled in her chest made her hands shake, and the shirts came back rejected more often than accepted. The landlord, a man whose face I can still see clearly despite the passage of 55 years, had begun to knock upon our door with increasing frequency. His demands were simple: rent money or eviction. No charity lived in his heart, though he attended St. Botolph's each Sunday and sang the hymns loud enough for all to hear. It was Mrs. Pickering from the room below ours who first mentioned Mr. Grimsby. She was a bent woman whose own children had long since scattered to workhouses or worse fates, and she spoke of the chimney master with the sort of reverence usually reserved for clergy. "He takes boys," she told my mother one grey October morning as I listened from behind our thin door. "Feeds them, clothes them, teaches them a trade. Better than the workhouse, that is. Better than watching them starve." The workhouse. Even at 7, I knew what that word meant. I had seen the men and women who emerged from behind its walls. Broken things that had once been human, their eyes holding nothing but the memory of despair. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 had made these places deliberately harsh, designed to deter all but the most desperate. Yet here we were, standing at that very threshold. My mother's cough rattled through the wall that night, keeping me awake as I lay on the straw mattress I shared with little Mary and the baby, James. Through the cracked window, I could see the smoke rising from countless chimneys across London, each one a dark column against the grey sky. I did not know then that I was looking at my future, that those very chimneys would become as familiar to me as the lines on my own palm. The next morning brought Mr. Grimsby to our door. He was a large man, not fat but solid, like the foundation stones of the old churches. His coat was better than any garment I had ever seen, though still bearing the subtle marks of his trade. A fine dusting of soot along the shoulders that spoke of someone who still occasionally climbed. His face was weathered, but not unkind, and his eyes held the sort of practical assessment that comes to men who deal in necessities rather than luxuries. "The boy," he said to my mother, though his gaze rested on me. "He's small for 7, but that's no disadvantage in my line of work. The newer houses, they're building the flues narrower every year. Need boys who can slip through spaces a grown man couldn't manage." Mother's hands twisted the edge of her shawl, and I could hear the wheeze in her chest as she spoke. "He's a good boy, Mr. Grimsby. Never been any trouble. Quick to learn, he is." "I don't doubt it." Grimsby knelt to my level, his large hands resting on his knees. "Tell me, lad, are you afraid of dark places?" I considered this question with the seriousness it deserved. The truth was, I'd grown accustomed to darkness. Our single room faced north and received little sunlight even on the brightest days. But the darkness he spoke of was different, I sensed. This was the darkness of purpose, of work, of survival. "No, sir," I replied, "not if there's a reason for going there." He smiled then, the first genuine smile I had seen in our room for months. "There's always a reason, boy. Always a reason." The terms were simple enough. I would become his apprentice, bound to him for 7 years, or until I reached the age of 14, whichever came first. He would provide food, lodging, and training in the trade of chimney sweeping. In return, my mother would receive 2 shillings immediately, and 6pence each month thereafter, enough to keep her and the younger children from the workhouse, at least for a time. I did not know then that I was being sold, though the word would not have meant much to me if I had understood it. In those days, children were commodities to be traded, their small size and nimble fingers valued in industries that adults could not manage. The Factory Act of 1833 had begun to limit the working hours of children in textile mills, but chimney sweeping remained largely unregulated. Boys like me slipped through the gaps in the law as easily as we slipped through the gaps in London's chimneys. The farewell was brief. Mother held me close enough that I could feel the tremor in her thin frame, and she whispered words I cannot now recall, but whose meaning has stayed with me across the decades. Mary and little James watched with the solemn eyes of children who understand that something important is happening but lack the experience to comprehend its full meaning. "Be good," Mother said as Grimsby's hand settled on my shoulder. "Be brave." I nodded, though I did not fully understand what either of those things would require of me in the years to come. Grimsby's lodging house stood in Bermondsey, across the river from the grand buildings of Westminster and the city. It was a narrow structure, squeezed between a tannery and a chandler's shop, its brick facade stained black with soot and age. The smell that greeted me as we entered was complex coal dust and tallow, unwashed bodies, and the sharp scent of vinegar that Grimsby used to treat the inevitable scrapes and cuts that came with the trade. The interior was dim but clean, with wooden floors that showed the marks of regular scrubbing. A common room on the ground floor held a large table surrounded by mismatched chairs and a fireplace that, I would learn, was never allowed to grow cold during the working months. The irony was not lost on me even then. We whose livelihood depended on chimneys kept our own fire burning constantly. "Boys," Grimsby called as we entered, and from various corners of the building they appeared. 8 of them in total, ranging in age from what looked to be 6 or 7 up to perhaps 13. All bore the marks of the trade, the permanent grey staining of the skin that no amount of washing could remove, the slight stoop that came from crawling through narrow spaces, the way they moved with the careful economy of those who had learned to navigate in darkness. "This is Thomas," Grimsby announced. "He'll be joining us." The introductions that followed blur together in memory, but certain faces remain clear. There was William, a boy of perhaps 11, whose left arm bore old burn scars from a close encounter with a still hot flue. Samuel, the oldest among us, who had been with Grimsby for nearly 6 years and whose knowledge of London's chimneys was encyclopedic. And Peter, barely 6 years old, whose cough already carried the telltale rattle that would plague all of us before our apprenticeships were through. That first evening, as we gathered around the common table for our supper of bread and dripping with weak beer, Samuel explained the hierarchy that governed our small world. Grimsby was master, of course, his word absolute in all matters relating to work and discipline. Below him were the older boys, those with 3 or more years of experience, who served as guides and protectors for the newer apprentices. At the bottom were boys like Peter and myself, expected to follow orders without question, and learn through observation and painful experience. "The work starts before dawn," Samuel told me as we shared a bowl of thin soup. "We go where Mr. Grimsby sends us. Sometimes the grand houses in Mayfair, sometimes the rookeries in Seven Dials. Each chimney is different, you see. Each one has its own tricks, its own dangers." Dangers. The word hung in the air like smoke, and I would come to understand its full meaning in the days and weeks that followed. The first chimney I climbed was in a modest house near London Bridge, the home of a clerk who worked in one of the counting houses that lined the Thames. The chimney was relatively wide, what Grimsby called a good starter, and the homeowner had allowed it to grow cold overnight in preparation for our visit. I remember standing in that basement scullery, looking up at the dark opening that seemed to swallow all light, while William explained the basics of the climb. The brush and scraper hung heavy in my small hands, and the sack for collecting soot felt impossibly large strapped across my shoulders. "Don't fight the walls," William advised. "Press your back against one side, your knees and feet against the other. Move up slow and steady. If you panic, if you try to hurry, you'll slip. And slipping..." He didn't need to finish. I had already heard enough stories from the other boys to understand that falling down a chimney was not a mistake one survived easily. The ascent was unlike anything I had ever experienced. The world narrowed to the width of my shoulders and the length of my arms. The darkness was complete, broken only by the occasional glimpse of daylight far above, a square of grey sky that seemed impossibly distant. The walls pressed against me from all sides, rough brick that scraped my skin despite the canvas jacket Grimsby had provided. The soot filled my nose and mouth, coating my throat with its bitter taste. But I climbed, hand over hand, inch by inch, pausing to scrape and brush as William had taught me, collecting the accumulated debris of months of fires. My world became a rhythm. Scrape, brush, climb. Scrape, brush, climb. The muscles in my legs and back burned with the effort, but I continued upward, driven by the knowledge that there was no other choice. When I finally emerged onto the rooftop, gasping in the clean air and blinking in the pale morning light, I felt something I had never experienced before, a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with praise or reward. I had faced the darkness and emerged. I had learned the first lesson of my trade, that fear was something to be acknowledged but never allowed to rule. William greeted me with a nod of approval, and together we began the careful process of cleaning the chimney pot and checking the pointing around the stack. From that rooftop, I could see across the Thames to the spires of the city churches, their bells beginning the calls to morning prayer. London spread out below us like a vast map written in brick and smoke, and for the first time since leaving my mother's room, I felt something approaching contentment. The work was hard, certainly harder than anything I had known before, but it was work with purpose, work that people needed done. And in a world where so many had no work at all, that was no small thing. The days began to settle into a pattern. We rose before dawn, breaking our fast on bread and small beer, while Grimsby consulted his ledger and assigned the day's work. The routes were planned with military precision houses in Belgravia, followed by tenements in Whitechapel, the grand mansions of Park Lane balanced against the narrow rookeries of St Giles. Each chimney had its price, from the 3p we might earn for a simple cottage flue to the 2 shillings that came from cleaning the complex system in a house of 20 rooms. I learned to read the city through its chimneys. The newer houses, built since the Great Fire, had flues designed with some consideration for the boys who must climb them. But the older structures, some dating back to Tudor times, were treacherous mazes, where medieval builders had added chimney after chimney without regard for those who might one day need to navigate their twisting passages. The grand houses of the West End were both blessing and curse. The chimneys were generally wider and better maintained, but the servants who greeted us often treated us as little better than the soot we carried. We entered through servants' entrances, were forbidden to touch anything beyond our immediate work, and were expected to complete our tasks with minimal disturbance to the household's routine. I remember one morning in December of that first year, climbing a chimney in a house near Grosvenor Square, where the family was preparing for a Christmas party. Through the thin walls, I could hear the sounds of preparation servants polishing silver, musicians tuning their instruments, the rustle of silk gowns being aired. The contrast between their world and mine was not lost on me, even at 7 years old. They lived in light and warmth and comfort, while I crawled through the dark spaces that made their comfort possible, breathing the ashes of their fires, carrying away the residue of their prosperity. Yet I harboured no resentment. Resentment was a luxury for those who had choices, and I had learned quickly enough that my choices were limited. I could climb chimneys for Mr. Grimsby, I could face the workhouse, or I could risk the streets with all their attendant dangers. Of these options, the chimneys seemed the most promising path to survival. The other boys in Grimsby's house became my family in ways both necessary and inevitable. We shared everything, the work, the dangers, the small pleasures that came our way. When Peter's cough worsened during the harsh winter of 1843, we all contributed portions of our meagre meals to ensure he maintained enough strength to work. When William burned his hand on a hot flue in a house near Cheapside, we took turns completing his assigned chimneys until the wound healed well enough for him to climb again. Samuel, being the oldest and most experienced among us, naturally assumed the role of leader in Grimsby's absence. He knew every trick of the trade, every shortcut and dangerous passage in London's maze of chimneys. More importantly, he understood the unwritten rules that governed our survival. "Never let them see you're hurt," he told us one evening as we sat around the common room fire, treating our various scrapes and bruises with Grimsby's vinegar. "Masters don't like boys who can't work, and householders don't want to think about what their comfort costs. You show pain, you show weakness, and weakness don't earn wages." This lesson proved its worth time and again. The work was inherently dangerous, despite Grimsby's care in training us and his insistence on proper equipment. Burns from hot flues were common, especially during the winter months when homeowners sometimes forgot to extinguish their fires completely before our arrival. Cuts from sharp brick edges were inevitable, as were the scrapes and bruises that came from navigating narrow spaces in complete darkness. More serious were the falls. I witnessed 3 during my time with Grimsby, though I will not dwell on their details beyond noting that the human frame was not designed to tumble down a vertical shaft lined with rough masonry. The first occurred in my second year, when a boy named Michael, new to the house and nervous about his work, lost his footing while descending a particularly treacherous flue in Bloomsbury. The silence that followed his fall echoes in my memory still. Then the sounds began. Sounds I will not describe in detail, sounds that taught me more about mortality than any sermon I had ever heard. Grimsby was summoned immediately and a physician was called, but there are injuries from which recovery is not possible. Michael's path ended that grey February morning, and his place at our table was taken by another boy before the week was out. Such was the nature of our trade. Boys were expendable, easily replaced, their small lives measured against the economic necessities of keeping London's chimneys clean. The authorities, when they took notice at all, concerned themselves with the broader questions of child labour in factories and mills. Chimney sweeps remained largely invisible, carrying out our dangerous work in the hidden spaces between walls, seen only as we arrived and departed from the houses we served. Yet despite the dangers, despite the hard conditions and meagre rewards, I found aspects of the work that spoke to something deep within me. There was satisfaction in completing a difficult climb, in emerging from a complex chimney system with every flue properly cleaned and inspected. there was pride in the gradual accumulation of skill, in learning to navigate by touch alone through passages so narrow that light never penetrated their depths. Most of all, there was the view from London's rooftops. In those moments when I emerged from the darkness into daylight, perched high above the streets with the great city spread below me, I felt a freedom that I had never known in the cramped tenement of my childhood. Up there, above the smoke and noise and crush of street life, London revealed itself as something magnificent, a vast organism of brick and mortar, wood and iron, all connected by the network of chimneys that were my domain. I learned to read the city's moods from those elevated perches. On clear mornings, I could see for miles in every direction, from the green spaces of Hyde Park to the forest of masts along the Thames. On foggy days, the world disappeared into a grey void that made our rooftop work treacherous, but strangely peaceful. During the winter months, when snow lay heavy on the slates and tiles, London took on a hushed quality that made even the busiest thoroughfares seem quiet and contemplative. The seasons marked our work as surely as they marked the growth of crops in distant countryside. Winter was our busiest time, when every household in London seemed to burn coal from dawn to midnight. The chimneys worked harder during the cold months, accumulating soot and debris at a rate that required frequent cleaning. These were the months when we earned the bulk of our annual income, when Grimsby's ledger showed profits that would carry us through the leaner times of summer. Spring brought different challenges. As the weather warmed and household fires were extinguished, we turned to the annual deep cleaning that many houses required. These were complex jobs, often involving multiple chimneys and extensive repairs to pointing and flue linings. The work was less urgent than winter's regular cleaning, but more thorough and time-consuming. Summer was our quiet season, when many wealthy families departed London for their country estates, leaving their townhouses shuttered and their chimneys cold. We used these months for maintenance repairing our equipment, training new apprentices, and taking on the occasional job for households that maintained year-round fires for cooking or hot water. Autumn marked the return to full activity as London's residents prepared for another winter and scheduled the cleaning that would make their chimneys safe for heavy use. These were often our most technically challenging jobs, involving chimneys that had been neglected during the summer months and required careful assessment to identify potential problems. Through all these seasons, I grew not just in size and strength, but in understanding of my trade and my place in London's complex social structure. I learned to assess chimneys not just as physical challenges to be climbed, but as problems to be solved through careful observation and accumulated experience. Each house had its peculiarities, its unique combination of age, architectural style, and maintenance history that affected how its chimneys should be approached. The tools of our trade were simple but essential. The brush a long-handled implement with stiff bristles that could scrape years of accumulated soot from flue walls. The scraper a sharp-edged tool for removing hardened deposits that the brush could not dislodge. The bag made of canvas or leather, designed to collect the debris we removed and allow for its safe transport out of the house. And the rod's sectional implements that could be assembled to clean chimneys from below, though this method was less thorough than a proper climb, and rarely satisfied the more particular householders. But the most important tool was knowledge, the accumulated understanding of how chimneys were built, how they deteriorated over time, and how to navigate their hidden dangers safely. This knowledge was passed down from master to apprentice, from older boys to younger, through a combination of formal instruction and hard-won experience. Samuel was my primary teacher in these matters. During the long evenings in Grimsby's lodging house, when the day's work was done and we sat around the common room fire, he would quiz me on the different types of chimney construction I might encounter. Tudor chimneys, he would say, built before the Great Fire. What do you know about them? Wide at the base, I would reply, but they narrow as they go up, often have false turns and dead ends where the builders added new flues without proper planning. The mortar is usually old and crumbling, so you have to test each handhold before trusting your weight to it. Georgian houses, straighter flues, better planning, but they like to cluster multiple chimneys together. Easy to take a wrong turn and end up in someone's bedroom fireplace instead of on the roof. Modern construction, narrower overall, built with the sweep in mind, but the new Portland cement can be sharp as glass when it's fresh. Need to be careful of cuts. This education continued throughout my apprenticeship, supplemented by direct experience that sometimes confirmed Samuel's teachings and sometimes revealed their limitations. No two chimneys were exactly alike, and the successful sweep was one who could adapt quickly to unexpected conditions. The social aspects of our work were equally complex. We occupied a unique position in London's rigid class structure necessary servants who were nonetheless treated with varying degrees of suspicion and disdain. To the wealthy households of Mayfair and Belgravia, we were barely visible, expected to complete our work without disturbing the household's routine or leaving any trace of our presence. To the struggling families of Whitechapel and Bermondsey, we were fellow members of the labouring classes, sharing the common experience of hard work for small reward. Yet even among the working poor, there were gradations. Chimney sweeps were considered rough company by many, our permanent staining and association with dirt making us unwelcome in some circles. The fact that we were children made little difference in the eyes of many. We were already marked by our trade, set apart from respectable society by the very nature of our work. This social isolation might have been crushing, but the close bonds within Grimsby's household provided compensation. We were a family of sorts, united by shared hardship and mutual dependence. The older boys looked after the younger ones, sharing their knowledge and protecting them from the worst dangers of the work. The younger boys, in turn, showed proper respect to their elders and contributed what they could to the common welfare. Grimsby himself remained a somewhat distant figure, though not an unkind one. He was first and foremost a businessman, concerned with maintaining his reputation and ensuring the profitability of his operation. But he also understood that his success depended entirely on the skills and dedication of his apprentices. A master who treated his boys harshly soon found himself without workers, as word spread quickly through London's network of child labourers, about which employers could be trusted and which could not. He provided adequate food and lodging, basic medical care when injuries occurred, and fair distribution of the earnings that came from our work. The boys received small amounts of pocket money, typically a penny or two per week, while the bulk of our earnings went toward a room and board, equipment, and Grimsby's own profit. This arrangement seemed equitable enough at the time, though I would later learn that many masters were far less generous with their apprentices. More importantly, Grimsby taught us to take pride in our work. A properly cleaned chimney was not just a completed job, but a demonstration of skill and craftsmanship. The reputation of his business depended on thoroughness and reliability, and he insisted that every job be completed to the same high standard, regardless of the customer's status or the fee involved. A chimney that's been swept by Grimsby's boys, he would say, stays swept. We don't do careless work, and we don't leave problems for the next fellow to fix. Your name is on every job you do, even if the customer never learns it. This philosophy shaped my approach to work throughout my life, extending far beyond my years as a chimney sweep. The idea that one's personal integrity was reflected in the quality of one's labour became fundamental to my character, a principle that served me well in later occupations and circumstances. The city itself was our constant companion and teacher. London in the 1840s was a place of extraordinary contrasts, where medieval streets wound between modern buildings, where immense wealth existed alongside abject poverty, where the latest innovations in technology and industry coexisted with working conditions that had changed little since Tudor times. The Great Exhibition of 1851 brought these contrasts into sharp focus, as London prepared to showcase British industry and ingenuity to the world. The everyday reality of life for working children remained largely unchanged. We continued to climb chimneys in houses that neighboured the Crystal Palace construction site, our small lives proceeding according to the same rhythms that had governed child labour for generations. I remember cleaning chimneys in houses near Hyde Park during the months when the Great Exhibition was being prepared. The sound of construction work filled the air, hammers ringing against iron, teams of horses hauling materials, the shouts of foremen directing their crews. The contrast between that celebration of progress and the ancient, dangerous nature of our own work was not lost on me, even as a boy of 9. Yet there were signs that change was coming, though slowly and against considerable resistance from those who profited from existing arrangements. The first significant reform came in 1840 with the Chimney Sweeps Act, which officially prohibited the apprenticing of boys under 10 years of age and required that all apprentices be properly fed, clothed, and educated. The practical effect of this legislation was limited, as enforcement was sporadic and penalties for violations were light. Many masters simply ignored the new requirements, while others found ways to circumvent them through creative interpretations of the law's language. Boys continued to be apprenticed well below the minimum age, and the promised education and proper care remained more aspiration than reality for most. But the law did represent a shift in public attitudes, a growing recognition that the treatment of child labourers was a matter of legitimate social concern. This change was driven partly by humanitarian sentiment, but also by practical considerations. Reports of boys becoming trapped in chimneys, injured by falls, or succumbing to the various illnesses associated with constant exposure to soot and smoke. The medical evidence was becoming difficult to ignore. Chimney sweeps suffered from a distinctive set of ailments that physicians were beginning to document with increasing precision. The most feared was chimney sweeps cancer, a malignant growth that typically appeared on the skin areas most exposed to soot. This condition was almost invariably fatal, and its association with our trade was so well established that it served as compelling evidence for reformers arguing that the work was inherently unsuitable for children. More common, but also serious, were the respiratory problems that affected virtually everyone in the trade. The constant inhalation of soot and smoke particles led to chronic coughing, difficulty breathing, and what physicians termed black lung, a condition that gradually reduced the victim's ability to draw adequate breath. I developed my own version of this affliction during my second year with Grimsby, a persistent cough that worsened in damp weather and never entirely disappeared. There were other hazards as well. Burns from hot flues were common, as were cuts and scrapes from rough masonry. More serious were the falls that occurred when boys lost their footing in narrow passages or when deteriorated chimney structure gave way under their weight. The statistics, when anyone bothered to collect them, painted a grim picture of an industry that consumed children's health and lives with disturbing regularity. Yet for all these dangers, chimney sweeping remained one of the few trades available to boys of our background and circumstances. The alternatives workhouse labour, factory work, or life on the streets each carried their own risks and offered even fewer rewards. In a society where child labour was not only accepted but economically necessary, chimney sweeping represented a form of skilled work that provided at least some security and the possibility of eventual advancement. The skilled aspect of our trade was often overlooked by those who saw only dirty children emerging from chimneys. In reality, successful chimney sweeping required considerable technical knowledge, physical skill, and mental discipline. The ability to navigate complex chimney systems in complete darkness, to assess structural integrity by touch alone, and to work efficiently in confined spaces demanded training and experience that took years to acquire. I began to appreciate this complexity as my own skills developed. By my third year with Grimsby, I could climb chimneys that would have seemed impossible when I first arrived. The narrow flues of newer houses, the twisted passages of Tudor-era buildings, the interconnected networks of grand mansions all became familiar territory that I could navigate with increasing confidence and efficiency. This growing expertise brought its own satisfactions. There was genuine pleasure in completing a particularly challenging job, in solving the puzzle of a complex chimney system, in emerging onto a rooftop with the knowledge that the work had been done properly and thoroughly. These moments of professional pride provided compensation for much of the hardship and danger that defined our daily lives. The view from London's rooftops offered more than just professional satisfaction. It provided a unique perspective on the great city's daily rhythm and seasonal changes. From those elevated perches, I could observe patterns of life that were invisible at street level. The movement of smoke from thousands of chimneys told stories about household routines, economic conditions, and social customs that shaped the lives of Londoners across all classes. During the winter months, the heaviest smoke rose from the chimneys of working-class neighbourhoods in the early morning hours, as families lit fires for cooking and warmth before beginning their daily labours. The chimneys of wealthy districts came alive later, as servants prepared houses for their employers' comfort and convenience. By evening, the pattern reversed, with working-class fires dying down, as coal became too expensive to burn for heat alone, while the chimneys of grand houses continued smoking late into the night. The quality of smoke itself varied dramatically across the city's social geography. The poor burned whatever fuel they could afford, often low-grade coal mixed with wood scraps, paper, and other combustible refuse. This produced thick, acrid smoke that burned the eyes and throat even from a distance. Wealthy households burned cleaner coal and well-seasoned wood, producing lighter smoke that dispersed more readily in the air. These observations taught me to read London's economic and social patterns through the evidence of its chimneys. A sudden reduction in smoke from working-class districts might signal unemployment or economic hardship. An increase in activity from grand houses could indicate the social season's beginning or preparation for large entertainments. The chimneys served as a barometer of the city's collective fortunes, their daily rhythms reflecting the complex web of relationships that bound London's diverse population together. The seasonal changes were equally instructive. Spring's arrival was marked not just by warmer weather, but by a gradual decrease in chimney activity as households reduced their reliance on fires. Summer brought a different pattern entirely, with only cooking fires and the occasional warm day creating demand for our services. Autumn's return was heralded by the resumption of full chimney activity, as London prepared for another winter's battle against cold and damp. Each season brought its own working conditions and challenges. Winter work was the most demanding, but also the most lucrative, as every household in London seemed to require our services. The cold made climbing more difficult, as metal fixtures became painful to touch and the ever-present dampness penetrated even our heaviest clothing. But the steady demand for our work meant regular income and the security of knowing that employment would continue regardless of broader economic conditions. Spring and autumn offered the best working conditions, with moderate temperatures and generally clear weather that made rooftop work less hazardous. These were the seasons for major maintenance jobs, when we might spend entire days on a single house, cleaning multiple chimneys and making repairs that had been deferred during the busy winter months. Summer presented different challenges. With reduced demand for our services, income became irregular, and Grimsby was forced to compete more aggressively for the available work. We took on jobs that might be refused during busier times, difficult or dangerous chimneys in poorly maintained houses, work for customers who were slow to pay, assignments in areas of London that were normally avoided due to disease or social unrest. But summer also brought opportunities for learning and improvement. With fewer immediate demands on our time, Grimsby could invest more effort in training, teaching us techniques and skills that would make us more valuable workers when busy season returned. The older boys used this time to pass on their knowledge to younger apprentices, sharing the accumulated wisdom of their experience in the trade. It was during one such summer training session that I first learned about the political dimensions of our work. Samuel, now in his final year of apprenticeship and preparing to establish himself as an independent sweep, spoke about the reform movements that were gaining strength among London's working classes. "There's talk," he said as we sat on Grimsby's roof one July evening, practicing our knots and rope work, "of new laws to protect boys like us. Real laws, with teeth in them, not like the ones they've passed before." The idea seemed impossible to me at the time. Laws were made by gentlemen in Parliament, men who lived in the grand houses we cleaned, but who had never climbed a chimney or breathed the smoke that was our daily bread. What could they know of our circumstances, and why would they care enough to change them? But Samuel had connections beyond Grimsby's household. His older brother worked in a factory that had been affected by the various Factory Acts, and through him, Samuel had learned about the organised efforts to improve working conditions for children across London's industries. These movements were beginning to focus attention on trades that had previously escaped legislative notice, including chimney sweeping. The reformers faced significant opposition from economic interests that depended on child labour, but they also had powerful allies among religious leaders, medical professionals, and social reformers who were documenting the human cost of industrial exploitation. Their arguments were gaining ground in Parliament and in the press, creating momentum for more comprehensive protective legislation. Lord Shaftesbury emerged as the leading parliamentary advocate for child welfare, using his position in the House of Lords to highlight the conditions faced by working children across British industry. His speeches about chimney sweeps were particularly effective, combining detailed descriptions of our working conditions with medical evidence about the health consequences of the trade. The pressure for reform was building, but change came slowly and against determined resistance. Master sweeps argued that boys were essential to the trade, that adult workers could not perform the same tasks, and that regulation would destroy their businesses and eliminate employment for thousands of children. Property owners complained that alternative cleaning methods were less effective and more expensive, threatening the safety and efficiency of London's heating systems. These economic arguments carried considerable weight in parliamentary debates, where practical concerns about industrial efficiency often outweighed humanitarian considerations. But the reformers had one powerful weapon in their arsenal: the growing documentation of deaths and serious injuries among chimney sweep apprentices. The case that finally captured public attention involved a boy named George Brewster, who met his end in a chimney in Fulbourn Hospital near Cambridge in 1875. The details of his passing were reported extensively in the newspapers, and the public outcry that followed helped secure passage of the Chimney Sweepers Act of 1875, which finally prohibited the use of children for climbing chimneys altogether. But I am getting ahead of my story. In 1845, when I was 10 years old, such comprehensive reform still lay decades in the future. The immediate reality of my life remained unchanged. The daily routine of climbing chimneys, the constant exposure to soot and smoke, the physical demands that tested the limits of a child's endurance. That year brought personal tragedy that drove home the precarious nature of our existence. My mother, whose consumption had worsened steadily since my apprenticeship began, finally succumbed to the disease that autumn. The news reached me through Mrs. Pickering, who appeared at Grimsby's door one October morning with the solemn expression that I had learned to associate with bearer of ill tidings. The end had come peacefully, she assured me, though I wondered how peaceful any departure could be, when it left 3 young children orphaned and dependent on parish relief. Mary, now 9, had been taken into domestic service with a family in Greenwich. The baby James, barely 4, had been admitted to the workhouse. Little Tom, who had been born after my departure, had been placed with a wet nurse whose care was paid for by the parish until such time as he could be apprenticed to some trade. I felt the loss keenly, though it was complicated by the knowledge that I had not seen my mother in more than 3 years. The boy who had left her room in Dorset Street had been replaced by someone harder, more self-reliant, shaped by experiences she could never have imagined. We had become strangers connected only by blood and memory, separated by the gulf that divided her world of poverty and illness from my world of dangerous work and gradual independence. Grimsby granted me a day's leave to attend the burial at St. Botolph's churchyard, though he made clear that the loss of work time would be deducted from my monthly allowance. The ceremony was brief and sparsely attended. Mrs. Pickering, myself, and the parish clerk, who read the service over a grave that would be marked only by a wooden cross bearing my mother's name and the dates of her birth and passing. Standing in that churchyard, looking down at the rough wooden box that contained all that remained of the woman who had given me life, I felt something close to relief alongside my grief. Her struggles were over, her pain ended. The consumption that had ravaged her body for years could torment her no longer. In a world where suffering was the common lot of the poor, there was mercy in the completion of even a difficult path. The winter of 1845 proved harsh beyond the usual London standard. Coal became scarce and expensive as supply problems developed, leading many households to burn their fires less frequently and at lower temperatures. Paradoxically, this created more work for sweeps, as the incomplete combustion produced by cooler fires generated more soot and creosote build-up in chimney systems. I remember one particularly bitter February morning when we were called to clean chimneys in a grand house near Park Lane. The household had attempted to economise on fuel by burning a mixture of coal and green wood, creating a thick tarry residue that coated the flue walls like black paint. The material was almost impossible to remove with normal brushing and required careful scraping with our sharpest tools. The work was made more dangerous by the fact that the flues were still slightly warm from the previous evening's fire. In our haste to complete the job and move on to the next appointment, I pressed too close to a section where hot spots remained, burning my left shoulder through the canvas jacket that was supposed to provide protection. The wound was not serious, but it served as a reminder of how quickly routine work could become hazardous when conditions were less than ideal. Such incidents were becoming more common as competition for work intensified and masters pressed their boys to complete jobs more quickly and efficiently. Grimsby remained more careful than some of his competitors, but even he felt the economic pressure to maximise productivity and minimise time spent on individual assignments. The older boys began to speak more frequently about life after apprenticeship, about the possibility of establishing independent businesses or finding work in related trades. Samuel, now approaching his 14th birthday and the end of his contracted service, had already begun making connections with potential customers who might employ his services directly rather than working through an established master. This transition from apprentice to independent craftsman was not guaranteed to succeed. London had more sweeps than the market could easily support, and established masters like Grimsby controlled many of the most lucrative accounts. A newly independent sweep faced the challenge of building a customer base from nothing, often competing against former colleagues and masters for the same work. But the alternative remaining as a paid employee offered little more security and considerably less potential for advancement. Most master sweeps employed only a few adult workers alongside their apprentices, and these positions rarely provided more than subsistence wages. Independence, despite its risks, represented the only realistic path to economic improvement for someone in our trade. I began to consider my own future more seriously as my apprenticeship progressed. By 1846, I was 11 years old and had acquired considerable skill in the technical aspects of chimney sweeping. I could navigate complex flue systems with confidence, assess structural problems that might require repair, and work efficiently even under difficult conditions. But I was also becoming aware of the physical toll the work was taking on my body. The persistent cough that had developed during my second year showed no signs of improvement. My growth had been stunted by the constant crouching and crawling required by the work, leaving me smaller than boys of similar age who had not been subjected to such physical demands. Most troubling, I had begun to develop the characteristic skin problems that affected long-term sweeps areas of discoloured, roughened skin that would never return to normal appearance. These changes were not unusual among boys in our trade, but they marked us as permanently different from the general population. Even if I eventually left chimney sweeping for other work, the evidence of my years in the trade would remain visible for the rest of my life. I would always be recognisable as someone who had crawled through London's chimneys, marked by the soot that had become part of my very being. The social implications of this marking extended beyond mere appearance. Chimney sweeps occupied a specific place in London's complex hierarchy of trades and occupations, generally regarded as rough company, suitable only for the most basic forms of social interaction. Marriage prospects were limited to women from similar backgrounds, and opportunities for advancement into more respectable occupations were virtually non-existent. Yet within these constraints there remained possibilities for a form of dignity and even modest prosperity. The best sweeps commanded respect for their skill and reliability, building relationships with customers that lasted for decades. A sweep who maintained high standards and dealt honestly with his clients could establish a secure living, even if he would never be accepted into polite society. These considerations occupied much of my thinking during the winter months of 1846, when work was plentiful, but the physical demands seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. I was no longer the 7-year-old boy who had first climbed into darkness, but I was not yet ready to take on the responsibilities of independent business. The spring of 1847 brought an event that would reshape my understanding of both my trade and my place in London's social structure. A new apprentice arrived at Grimsby's house, a boy named David, perhaps 8 years old, whose story differed significantly from the familiar pattern of poverty and desperation that had brought the rest of us to chimney sweeping. David's father had been a skilled craftsman, a cabinet maker whose workshop had failed due to changing fashions and increased competition from factory-produced furniture. Rather than see his son consigned to the workhouse, the man had used his remaining resources to purchase an apprenticeship with Grimsby, hoping to provide his child with a trade that might lead to eventual independence. The presence of this boy, whose speech and manners reflected a more privileged background than the rest of us possessed, created subtle tensions within our close-knit community. David struggled with the physical demands of the work more than most new apprentices, and his obvious distress at the conditions of our daily life highlighted aspects of chimney sweeping that we had learned to accept without question. More significantly, David's father maintained contact with his son, visiting regularly and asking detailed questions about the boy's treatment and training. This parental oversight was unusual in our experience. Most of us had been effectively abandoned by families who lacked the resources to maintain any meaningful connection. The knowledge that someone of higher social standing was monitoring conditions in Grimsby's house introduced an element of accountability that had previously been absent. The father's questions grew more pointed as David's health began to show the effects of constant exposure to soot and smoke. The boy developed a severe cough within months of beginning his apprenticeship, and his small frame seemed to shrink under the demands of daily climbing. When burn marks appeared on his arms from contact with hot flues, the father demanded explanations and threatened to remove his son from Grimsby's service. This confrontation brought into sharp focus the contradictions inherent in our trade. Chimney sweeping could not be made safe for children. The work itself required exposure to conditions that inevitably damaged growing bodies. Yet without child labour, the trade could not function efficiently enough to remain economically viable. The narrow flues of London's newer houses simply could not accommodate adult workers, making boys like us essential to the system. Grimsby handled the situation with characteristic pragmatism, offering to return a portion of the apprenticeship fee and helping the father find alternative placement for David with a master in a less demanding trade. But the incident had exposed uncomfortable truths about our circumstances that could not be easily forgotten or dismissed. The summer of 1847 provided time for reflection on these matters, as the seasonal reduction in demand allowed us to work at a more measured pace. I found myself spending more time on London's rooftops, using the maintenance and repair work of the quiet season as an excuse to observe the great city from my elevated vantage points. From these perches I could see evidence of the changes that were beginning to transform London's physical and social landscape. New railway lines were cutting through ancient neighbourhoods, bringing both opportunities and disruption to established communities. Construction of modern buildings with improved chimney designs was making some areas of our work obsolete, while creating new challenges in others. The great engineering projects of the era, the expanding railway network, the beginning work on what would become the Thames Embankment, the gradual modernisation of London's infrastructure, all pointed toward a future that would be fundamentally different from the world I had known as a child. Whether there would be a place for traditional chimney sweeps in this transformed city remained an open question. These broader changes were accompanied by more immediate shifts in public attitudes toward child labour. The reform movements that Samuel had described were gaining momentum, and their arguments were reaching a wider audience through newspaper coverage and parliamentary debates. The evidence of harm to children in various trades was becoming harder for even the most committed defenders of existing practices to ignore. Yet change remained frustratingly slow for those of us living under the current system. Reform legislation continued to focus primarily on factory work, where large numbers of workers concentrated in single locations made enforcement somewhat more practical. Trades like chimney sweeping, dispersed across thousands of individual households and small businesses, remained largely beyond the reach of regulatory oversight. The winter of 1847-48 brought personal challenges that tested both my physical endurance and my commitment to continuing in the trade. A fall in a particularly treacherous Tudor chimney near Smithfield left me with injuries that took weeks to heal completely, during which time I was unable to work and contributed nothing to the household's income. The accident occurred in a house whose chimney system dated to the 16th century, a maze of interconnected flues that had been modified repeatedly over the centuries, as different owners added new fireplaces and heating arrangements. The original builders had given little thought to the sweep, who might one day need to navigate their creation, resulting in passages that twisted and branched without apparent logic. I was descending from a complex cleaning job, moving carefully through a section where the flue narrowed significantly, when a section of ancient mortar gave way under my weight. The fall was not far, perhaps 8 feet, but I landed awkwardly on accumulated debris that included sharp fragments of broken brick. The immediate pain was intense, but more troubling was the realization that I was trapped in a section of the chimney system where calling for help would be difficult. The rescue, when it finally came, involved Samuel descending from above while William worked to enlarge the passage from below. The process took most of the afternoon and required considerable damage to the homeowner's property, for which Grimsby was obliged to pay compensation that far exceeded the original cleaning fee. My injuries included severe bruising along my left side and a cut on my leg that required careful cleaning and bandaging to prevent infection. But the lasting damage was to my confidence in navigating the more dangerous chimney systems that formed a regular part of our work. The knowledge that ancient mortar could fail without warning, that centuries-old construction might not support even a child's weight, introduced an element of uncertainty that made every climb more stressful. During the weeks of recovery that followed, I had time to consider alternatives to continuing in the trade. At 12 years old, I was approaching the age when some apprentices began to transition to other forms of work. My reading and writing skills, developed through the informal education that Grimsby provided his boys, were adequate for clerical positions if such opportunities could be found. My small stature and agility might be useful in other trades that required working in confined spaces. But the reality of London's labour market made such transitions difficult for someone of my background. Most respectable employers preferred workers who had not been marked by association with the rougher trades. The permanent staining of my skin and the telltale signs of respiratory problems would identify me as a former chimney sweep to anyone who cared to look closely. Even if I could secure other employment, the wages were likely to be lower than what I could earn by continuing in a trade where I had already achieved considerable skill. More fundamentally, I had developed a genuine attachment to the work itself, despite its dangers and hardships. There was satisfaction in completing difficult jobs, in solving the technical puzzles presented by complex chimney systems, in maintaining the reputation for reliability that Grimsby had worked years to establish. The idea of abandoning this expertise to start over in an unfamiliar field felt like a form of surrender. The decision to continue came gradually, through a series of small choices rather than a single moment of commitment. As my injuries healed and I began taking on easier assignments, I found that my fundamental competence had not been compromised by the accident. If anything, the experience had taught me to be more careful in assessing structural integrity, making me a safer and more effective worker. Spring brought renewed activity and the return to full-scale operations. The demand for cleaning services was particularly heavy that year, as a harsh winter had left many chimneys heavily fouled with soot and debris. Property owners who had deferred maintenance during the previous season were forced to schedule comprehensive cleaning to prevent fire hazards as warmer weather approached. I was assigned increasingly complex jobs as Grimsby recognised my growing expertise and reliability. The most challenging assignments went to the older boys who could handle both the technical demands and the customer relations aspects of the work, but I was beginning to take on responsibilities that would have been beyond my capabilities just a year earlier. One such assignment involved a grand house near Russell Square, whose chimney system included multiple interconnected flues serving fireplaces on 4 different floors. The complexity of the layout required careful mapping before any cleaning could begin, as it was easy to become lost in the maze of passages and emerge in the wrong room, or worse, become trapped in a dead-end section. The work took most of a day and required coordination between multiple boys working simultaneously in different parts of the system. Samuel supervised the operation while I handled one of the more challenging sections, a flue that served the main drawing room and required delicate handling to avoid damaging the decorative plasterwork surrounding the fireplace. The successful completion of this job marked a turning point in my development as a craftsman. Grimsby's approval was evident in his assignment of increased responsibilities, while the other boys began to treat me as a senior member of the household, despite my relatively young age. Most importantly, I felt a growing confidence in my ability to handle whatever challenges the trade might present. The summer of 1848 brought news that would ultimately transform the entire chimney sweeping industry, though its implications were not immediately apparent to those of us working in the trade. Parliament was considering new legislation that would impose stricter regulations on the employment of children in various industries, with particular attention to occupations that had previously escaped comprehensive oversight. Lord Shaftesbury continued his campaign for reform, presenting evidence about working conditions that painted a grim picture of child exploitation across British industry. His speeches included detailed descriptions of chimney sweeping that left little doubt about the physical and health consequences of the work for young boys. The economic arguments against reform remained strong, supported by master sweeps and property owners, who insisted that effective chimney cleaning required the use of small boys who could navigate narrow flues. Alternative methods, they argued, were less thorough and more expensive, threatening both the safety and efficiency of London's heating systems. But the reformers had begun to present technical evidence, suggesting that mechanical cleaning methods could achieve results comparable to traditional climbing techniques. New brush and rod systems, improved cleaning chemicals, and better understanding of chimney design were making it possible to clean most flues without requiring human entry. These developments were still in their early stages, and many master sweeps remained sceptical about their practical effectiveness. But the existence of viable alternatives undermined the fundamental argument that child labour was essential to the trade's survival. The political momentum for reform continued to build throughout 1848, driven by a combination of humanitarian concern and practical evidence about the costs of child exploitation. Medical testimony about the health consequences of chimney sweeping was particularly compelling, as physicians documented the specific diseases and injuries associated with the trade. Yet change, when it came, would not be immediate or complete. Even the most comprehensive reform legislation would require time for implementation and enforcement. Master sweeps would adapt their practices gradually, and many would find ways to circumvent new regulations through various forms of evasion and delay. For boys like me, caught in the transition between old and new systems, the implications remained uncertain. My apprenticeship with Grimsby was scheduled to continue for several more years, during which time the legal and practical framework governing our work might change significantly. Whether these changes would improve our conditions or simply eliminate our opportunities remained to be seen. The autumn of 1848 brought a personal milestone that marked my growing maturity and independence. Grimsby began sending me on solo assignments, small jobs that could be handled by a single sweep without supervision or assistance. These assignments were typically straightforward, cleaning simple flues in modest houses whose owners were more concerned with cost than ceremony. The trust implicit in these solo assignments represented significant progress in my development as a craftsman. Grimsby was risking his business reputation on my ability to complete jobs satisfactorily without oversight. More practically, he was acknowledging that my skills had reached a level where close supervision was no longer necessary. These independent assignments also provided my first direct experience with customer relations, the delicate social negotiations that accompanied most chimney cleaning jobs. Property owners expected competent technical work, but they also demanded proper deference, minimal disruption to household routines, and absolute cleanliness in areas beyond the immediate work site. Managing these expectations required skills that went beyond technical expertise. I learned to assess each customer's particular concerns and adapt my approach accordingly. Some valued efficiency above all else, wanting the work completed as quickly as possible with minimal interaction. Others were more particular about methods and required detailed explanations of the cleaning process and any problems discovered. The social dynamics of these interactions provided insight into class relationships that extended far beyond the immediate context of chimney sweeping. As a working-class boy entering middle-class and upper-class homes, I was expected to maintain a careful balance between competence and subservience, demonstrating my skills while acknowledging my inferior social position. These lessons in social navigation would prove valuable throughout my life, teaching me to read situations quickly and respond appropriately to different forms of authority and expectation. The ability to work effectively across class boundaries became one of my most useful skills, opening opportunities that would have been unavailable to someone who could not manage these complex social relationships. The winter of 1848 and 49 proved to be my last as a full-time chimney sweep apprentice, though I did not know it at the time. The season began normally enough, with the usual increase in demand as London's residents prepared their heating systems for another cold season. My assignments included some of the most challenging jobs in Grimsby's portfolio, reflecting both my increased capabilities and the trust he placed in my work. But as the season progressed, it became clear that significant changes were approaching the industry. Parliament was moving toward passage of comprehensive reform legislation that would fundamentally alter the employment of children in chimney sweeping and other trades. The details remained uncertain, but the general direction was unmistakable. The era of child labour in its traditional forms was drawing to a close. Master sweeps across London began to adapt their practices in anticipation of regulatory changes. Some invested in new equipment and training that would allow them to clean chimneys without using climbing buoys. Others began seeking older apprentices or adult workers who could handle the modified techniques that regulation would require. Grimsby took a characteristically practical approach to these developments, beginning to experiment with mechanical cleaning methods while maintaining his traditional services for customers who preferred the thoroughness of hand cleaning. He also began discussions with his older apprentices about transitioning to new forms of employment that would be less affected by regulatory changes. For me, these conversations opened possibilities that I had not seriously considered. My reading and writing skills, combined with my knowledge of London's building stock and my experience in dealing with property owners, made me a potentially valuable assistant in the administrative aspects of Grimsby's business. Rather than continuing as a climbing sweep, I might transition to scheduling, customer relations, and quality oversight functions. The prospect was both exciting and unsettling. After nearly 7 years in the trade, climbing chimneys had become as natural to me as walking. The thought of abandoning this expertise for office work represented a fundamental change in both my daily routine and my sense of personal identity. But the alternative, continuing to climb as an adult in a trade that was becoming increasingly regulated and mechanised, seemed even less attractive. Adult sweeps typically earned modest wages working for established masters, with limited opportunities for advancement or independence. The physical demands of the work also took an increasing toll as workers aged, leading to shortened careers and early disability for many. The decision, when it came, was made for me by external events rather than personal choice. In the spring of 1849, Parliament passed the Chimney Sweepers Regulation Act, which significantly tightened restrictions on the employment of children in the trade. While the law did not completely prohibit the use of climbing buoys, it imposed licensing requirements, health inspections, and educational mandates that many masters found difficult or expensive to meet. Grimsby assessed the new requirements and concluded that compliance would be costly and complicated without providing corresponding benefits to his business. Rather than invest in the additional supervision, record-keeping, and facilities that the law required, he decided to transition entirely to mechanical cleaning methods and adult workers. This decision effectively ended my apprenticeship several years before its scheduled completion. At 13, I was too young to be employed as an adult worker, but too old to continue as an apprentice under the new regulatory framework. The solution was a modified arrangement that kept me with Grimsby's business in a new capacity while providing training in skills that would be valuable in other contexts. I became Grimsby's assistant in the administrative aspects of his business, handling correspondence with customers, maintaining records of completed jobs, and coordinating the schedules of his adult workers. The position provided steady wages, more than I had ever received as an apprentice, while allowing me to develop skills in business management and customer relations. The transition was not easy. After years of physical work that provided immediate, tangible results, office duties seemed abstract and unsatisfying. I missed the challenge of difficult climbs, the satisfaction of completing complex cleaning jobs, and even the unique perspective on London that came from viewing the city from its rooftops. but gradually I began to appreciate the advantages of my new position. The work was physically less demanding, allowing my body to recover from years of strain and exposure. The business knowledge I was acquiring provided insights into economic relationships and market dynamics that would prove valuable in later endeavours. Most importantly, the position offered possibilities for advancement that had been largely absent from traditional chimney sweeping. The regulatory changes that had forced my career transition also created new opportunities in related trades. Property owners who could no longer rely on traditional chimney sweeping began seeking alternative methods of maintenance and inspection. Businesses specialising in mechanical cleaning, flue repair, and heating system modernisation expanded rapidly to meet this demand. My knowledge of chimney construction and maintenance, combined with my developing administrative skills, made me a valuable resource for companies entering these new markets. Several entrepreneurs approached me about joining their operations, offering wages and responsibilities that would have been unimaginable during my apprentice years. The choice I ultimately made reflected both practical considerations and personal loyalty. Rather than leave Grimsby's employ for potentially more lucrative opportunities, I proposed an expansion of his business into these new service areas. My suggestion was that he establish a comprehensive building maintenance operation that would provide not only chimney cleaning, but also inspection, repair, and modernisation services for London's changing housing stock. The proposal required considerable investment and involved risks that concerned Grimsby initially. But the potential returns were substantial, and my detailed knowledge of both the technical and market aspects of the opportunity eventually convinced him to proceed. The transformation of our business from traditional chimney sweeping to comprehensive building services took several years and required learning new skills while adapting old ones to changed circumstances. But by the early 1850s, we had established a successful operation that employed a dozen workers and served customers across central London. My role in this transformation established me as a junior partner in the business, with responsibilities that extended far beyond my original chimney sweeping expertise. I managed customer relationships, oversaw work quality, and helped develop new services that kept pace with London's evolving building technologies and regulatory requirements. The financial rewards of this transition exceeded anything I had imagined during my apprentice years. By 1855, I was earning wages that allowed me to rent comfortable lodgings, dress respectably, and begin accumulating savings that would provide security for the future. More importantly, I had acquired skills and knowledge that were transferable to other contexts, reducing my dependence on any single trade or employer. But perhaps the most significant change was in my social position. No longer marked as a member of the labouring classes by the permanent stains and physical damage of chimney sweeping, I could move more freely through different levels of London society. The business relationships I managed required interaction with customers from the middle and upper classes, providing opportunities to observe and learn from social groups that had previously been accessible only as an invisible service provider. This social mobility came with its own challenges and complications. My background remained evident to those who cared to look closely, and I often felt caught between worlds. No longer fully part of the working class community where I had grown up, but not yet accepted into the middle class society where my business activities increasingly placed me. The solution I learned was to focus on competence and reliability, rather than attempting to disguise or deny my origins. Customers who valued the quality of work and honesty of dealing cared less about social background than about results. This approach allowed me to build a reputation based on professional merit rather than inherited social position. By the late 1850s, the business had grown sufficiently to support my purchase of a partnership stake, making me a true co-owner rather than merely an employee. This achievement represented the culmination of a journey that had begun in the desperate poverty of a Spitalfields tenement and led through the dangerous passages of London's chimneys to modest prosperity and social respectability. The transformation was not without its costs. The years of climbing had left permanent marks on my health, the persistent cough that would never fully disappear, the joint stiffness that reminded me daily of countless hours spent in cramped positions, the skin discoloration that no amount of washing could ever completely remove. More subtly, the experience had shaped my character in ways that would influence every subsequent relationship and decision. The self-reliance developed through years of dangerous work made it difficult to depend on others or accept help when offered. The constant awareness of mortality that came from working in life-threatening conditions created a sense of urgency about achieving security and independence. But these were prices willingly paid for the knowledge that I had survived and prospered despite circumstances that defeated many others. The boys I had known during my apprentice years had scattered to various fates, some continuing in modified forms of chimney sweeping, others finding work in related trades, several succumbing to the illnesses and injuries that were the inevitable consequences of our former occupation. Peter, the youngest among us during my early years with Grimsby, had not survived to see the regulatory changes that transformed the industry. His persistent cough had worsened gradually until it claimed him during the harsh winter of 1850, when he was barely 12 years old. His path ended in a pauper's grave, similar to my mother's, marked only by a wooden cross that would decay and be forgotten within a few years. Samuel, who had been my mentor and guide during the apprentice years, established himself as an independent sweep, but struggled to adapt to the mechanical methods that regulation required. He continued working into the 1860s, serving customers who preferred traditional techniques despite their increasing rarity. But the physical demands of the work eventually forced him into early retirement, and he spent his final years as a pensioner dependent on parish relief. William, whose knowledge of London's building stock rivaled my own, found success in the construction industry, applying his understanding of structural systems to new building projects. His career paralleled mine in some respects, though he remained more focused on technical rather than business aspects of the work. The varying fates of my former colleagues illustrated both the possibilities and limitations that faced working-class children during the mid-19th century. Those who could adapt to changing economic and regulatory conditions might achieve modest prosperity and social advancement. But for every success story, there were others whose lives ended in poverty, illness, or early demise. The reforms that had transformed chimney sweeping represented broader changes in British society's approach to child welfare and labour regulation. The Factory Acts, Education Acts, and various welfare measures of the Victorian era gradually extended protection to children who had previously been treated as economic commodities with no rights or protections. But these changes came slowly and unevenly, often driven more by economic necessity than humanitarian sentiment. The mechanisation that made child labour unnecessary in many industries was motivated primarily by efficiency and cost considerations rather than concern for children's well-being. The chimney sweeping reforms succeeded largely because alternative cleaning methods had become technologically feasible and economically viable. Similar reforms in other industries often waited until changed production methods made child labour obsolete rather than occurring through pure legislative mandate. This pattern of changed technical innovation preceding social reform characterised much of the industrial transformation that reshaped British society during the 19th century. Children's welfare improved as a consequence of broader economic developments rather than as an independent policy objective. By the 1860s, the London I had known as a child chimney sweep was disappearing rapidly. The narrow, crooked streets of medieval neighbourhoods were being replaced by broad thoroughfares designed for modern traffic. Gaslighting was making nighttime activities safer and more practical. Improved water supply and sewerage systems were reducing the disease and mortality rates, that had made childhood survival uncertain for the poor. New forms of heating and cooking were reducing dependence on traditional fireplaces, making chimney maintenance less critical for household functioning. Central heating systems, gas stoves, and other innovations were beginning to appear in newer construction, promising eventually to make chimney sweeping unnecessary in many contexts. These changes created new opportunities while eliminating traditional ones. The building maintenance business that Grimsby and I had developed prospered by adapting to serve the modernising city's changing needs. But many of the skills and much of the knowledge that had been essential during my apprentice years were becoming obsolete. The personal significance of these transformations became clear to me during the 1870s, as I approached middle age and began to reflect on the journey that had brought me from childhood poverty to modest prosperity. The world that had shaped my early years, a world of child labour, unregulated working conditions, and limited opportunities for social advancement, was being replaced by something fundamentally different. The changes were not uniformly positive. New forms of poverty and exploitation emerged, even as old ones disappeared. Industrial development created environmental problems that affected public health in ways that had not existed during my childhood. Urban growth strained housing and transportation systems, creating different but equally serious social challenges. But for someone of my background and experience, the overall trajectory of change represented genuine progress. The legal protections, educational opportunities, and social services that were gradually extending to working-class children would have transformed my own childhood experience if they had existed during the 1840s. The most profound change was in social attitudes toward childhood itself. The idea that children deserved protection from adult economic pressures, that they had inherent rights independent of their economic value, that society bore responsibility for their welfare. These concepts had become increasingly accepted during my lifetime. This shift in thinking represented more than policy reform. It reflected a fundamental change in how British society conceived of itself and its obligations to its most vulnerable members. The nation that had once treated children as expendable labour was gradually accepting responsibility for their education, health, and general welfare. My own success in adapting to these changes owed much to the particular circumstances of my apprenticeship with Grimsby, whose relatively enlightened practices had provided education and training that proved valuable beyond the immediate context of chimney sweeping. But it also reflected the expanded opportunities that social and economic development was creating for those with the skills and determination to take advantage of them. By 1875, when Parliament finally passed comprehensive legislation prohibiting the use of children for chimney climbing, the practice had already been largely abandoned for economic and technical reasons. The regulatory changes formalised a transformation that market forces had already accomplished in most areas of the trade. This pattern legal reform, following rather than leading economic change, characterised much of the social progress that occurred during my lifetime. But the importance of formal legal protection should not be underestimated, as it provided security and legitimacy to improvements that might otherwise have been reversed during economic downturns or periods of social reaction. The final prohibition of child chimney sweeping represented the end of an era that had shaped not only my personal development, but the broader pattern of British industrial development. For more than a century, the narrow flues of London's buildings had been maintained by generations of boys whose small size and expendability made them suitable for work that adults could not perform safely or efficiently. The human cost of this system had been enormous. Thousands of children had suffered injury, illness, and premature demise to maintain the heating systems that kept London's homes and businesses functioning. Many more had survived, but bore permanent physical and social scars that marked them for life as members of the labouring classes. Yet the experience had also created opportunities for some to develop skills, knowledge, and resilience that served them well in later life. The technical expertise required for chimney sweeping, the social skills needed to work across class boundaries, and the personal discipline developed through years of dangerous work proved transferable to other contexts as economic opportunities expanded. The irony was not lost on me that the very industry that had exploited my childhood had also provided the foundation for my adult prosperity. The knowledge of building systems acquired during years of climbing had become the basis for a successful business career. The customer relationships developed while working as an apprentice had evolved into the professional network that sustained my later success. This complexity, the simultaneous exploitation and opportunity that characterized working-class experience during the Industrial Revolution, defied simple moral judgments. The system that had damaged my health and stunted my physical development had also taught me skills and provided connections that would have been unavailable through other paths. As I entered old age in the 1880s and 1890s, I found myself increasingly called upon to provide testimony about working conditions during the earlier decades of the century. Social reformers, government investigators, and historians sought first-hand accounts of child labour practices that were rapidly passing from living memory into historical record.